everybody, we are back for chapter 34 of book Scavenger. I cannot put this book down. I seriously cannot. And I'm telling everyone about this book all the time. I'm like always thinking about it. Is anyone else having that? Just me? No? I just love it. So Emily just cracked another code thanks to James and came up with the word scarab. So I guess this means scarab. No idea how you get that from that using this. I truly don't know. Maybe you guys can figure it out. I don't know, take a screenshot of this and work through it. I'm too excited to pause, so I'm gonna go to chapter 34. Here we go. Scarab. Scarab was the word Poe's narrator used in The Gold Bug. It meant beetle, like the glittering gold one on the cover, like the inky black one on the inside page. If scarab was the next clue, Emily had a sinking feeling she knew where Mr. Griswold was directing her. Back to the gold bug. Back to the book that had been taken away. Emily pressed her forehead into her hands, her elbows anchored to the library table. This was it. She'd reached the end of the line for Mr. Griswold's game. It was like working on a complicated jigsaw puzzle without knowing the final picture. Just as the pieces began to fall into place, you could almost make out the image. Someone came along and swiped it all onto the floor, and then vacuumed up the pieces for good measure. To choose to stop now would have been one thing. To have the power of choice taken from her made Emily feel insignificant and small. She raised her head and caught James studying her. They both looked away as if their eye contact burned. The bell rang and Emily started to pack up. She zipped her bag closed when James appeared next to her. Did you get it? Pink pen? Pig pen? Oh, Emily looked down for a second. I did. Thanks for the hint. Even if James could tell she was upset and asked her about it, she wasn't sure she wanted to explain why. James had wanted her to stop playing the game, and Emily couldn't bear the possibility of someone telling her that being forced to stop was for the best. All James said was, I recognized the symbols from one of my cipher books. I was happy to help. Sometimes two eyes are better than one. In a knee-jerk reply, Emily added, no offense to the Cyclops. They exchanged small smiles before James walked away. That afternoon in social studies, Mr. Quisling asked for any final attempts to break James's cipher. His long strip of letters was the only submission for the week. Emily held her breath, waiting to see if anyone raised his or her hand. The room remained silent, and Mr. Quisling said, Mr. Lee, your cipher has survived the week. Congratulations on winning your first homework pass. Emily couldn't resist peeking behind herself to look at Maddie, who scowled at her binder and scratched a doodle in the margins of her paper. James punched his fist in the air and tilted his head back to shout at the ceiling, Steve survives! The class tittered, and even Mr. Quisling looked somewhat bemused. Would you, or Steve, please illuminate for the class how your cipher works? James stood in the front of the class and held up his vertical strips of paper with the letters on it. So, as a reminder, we have the cipher here. It's vertical, and Emily was wondering why it's vertical, which made me wonder, why is it vertical? I use a type of cipher called the skytail. You take a vertical strip of paper like this and you wrap it around a cylinder-shaped object. James held up a pencil. He wrapped the strip around it and all the letters lined up horizontally. To decode my message, you have to wrap the paper around an object with the same diameter as the one the original message sender used in order for the letters to align correctly. This pencil is what I used. So you wrap it around. Genius. Crazy. Vivian raised her hand and spoke at the same time. Your message still doesn't make sense. You can't use nonsense words and expect us to figure them out. Can he, Mr. Quisling? Before Mr. Quisling could reply, Emily spoke up. Those aren't nonsense words, she said, realizing she could read James's message even though nobody else in the class could, and she smiled at what it said. He used a substitution cipher to encrypt his message as a backup in case you figured out the skytail, right? She asked James. He nodded, smiling. James held up a piece of paper that showed their secret code. This is the cipher key I use. Decoded, my message reads, Royal Fungus. That's clever. I love that. When James sat back down, Mr. Quisling clapped. Emily joined in without even thinking about it. She lowered her hands quickly, embarrassed by her show of enthusiasm. But James gave her half a smile and Steve a good job pat on his tips. Small gestures, but they made Emily feel a million times lighter. When the bell rang and everyone collected their things, James shuffled down the aisle and out of the classroom without a glance her way. Emily didn't realize she must have been obviously watching him until Maddie stood behind her and said, Looks like too little too late. She plumped up her mushroom cap hair with one hand. Maddie was only trying to get under her skin. Emily knew that. And it worked too, but not in the way Maddie might have been hoping for. Hearing her fear verbalized by Maddie that her friendship with James was over for good had the unexpected effect of making Emily realize how silly it sounded. It wasn't too late, and oddly enough, Maddie of all people had just given Emily a brilliant idea for how to make things right. Back at her apartment that afternoon, Emily wrote a note for the bucket. All it said was, here it is, it's in the cipher code. It says, "I'm sorry," right there. She placed the note in the sand pail. She picked up the reindeer antlers and taped the paper towel to them, arranging the items to look like a white flag waving for a truce. She shuffled the antlers in the pail, making sure the flag would be visible in James's window once raised. When the bucket had been lifted, she secured the rope so the pail would remain there until James retrieved it. A while later, the ceiling creaked. Emily James's window was opposite his door, so Emily knew he'd see the antler and flag when he walked into his room. Whether or not he'd check it was another story. The creaking stopped, then resumed again, and James's window slid open. His snorting laugh and the tinkle of a bell carried down through her open window. He returned her response. It says, "I'm sorry too." Emily sent up a follow-up note. "Can we talk?" So those are their two notes. Back and forth right there. They're making amends. Finally. James came over and they spent Friday evening catching up on the week. "You had those men trekking all the way to the sunset, and Babbage is Mr. Quisling?" He shook his head, disbelieving. "I stopped talking to you for a few days and all sorts of stuff happens. The most exciting thing for me was dinner with my dad at Michelangelo's. Winning a homework pass for Quisling's challenge was nothing to yawn over. You're one up on Maddie now. You know she's stressing that she'll have to make her hair look like a toadstool. Which reminds me, I have a plan I think you'll like. I'm calling it Operation Royal Fungus." Monday marked 3 days since Emily's dad had deciphered the scarab clue. It still stung to think about the gold bug squeezed onto a shelf somewhere and Mr. Griswold's game going dormant. But it was the words of her brother of all people that comforted her. I'm having trouble reading all of a sudden. She'd rather have played some of Mr. Griswold's game than none of it at all, and things had been righted with James, so she hadn't lost everything. On their walk to school, they rehearsed the plan for Operation Royal Fungus. It hinged on them maintaining the appearance of their fight, so they parted ways before they reached Booker. At lunchtime, James staked out a table next to Maddie's in the library, his latest code work spread in front of him. When Emily approached, James made a big show of scooping his papers together. "Can I help you?" he asked. His anger and annoyance was palpable. Emily forgot for a second they were pretending. She stammered. Maddie nudged the girl next to her and jutted her chin in Emily's direction, which was exactly the motivation Emily needed to surge forward with the lines she and James had practiced. "What are you working on?" she asked. James didn't look at her. Emily dropped into the seat beside him, their backs to Maddie. "James, come on. Are you still mad? You've won a homework pass now." He gathered his papers and tapped them against the table. "No thanks to you, and Maddie could make a comeback, so I haven't won our bet yet. This new cipher makes my other one look like a preschooler's puzzle. There's no way I'm sharing it with you and risking it being stolen or copied." "Your Bakian cipher would have been broken anyway," Emily said as James held the stack of papers behind him, hovering over his wide-open backpack. "I mean, binary code? Doesn't that seem kind of obvious? Especially coming from a computer geek like you." "What?" James released the papers. The plan was for them to fall on the floor instead of into the backpack. But for their scheme to be believable, neither one of them could make sure that was, in fact, what had happened. "Besides, I saw that idea in a book," Emily continued with their script. "Prove it." James grabbed his backpack without looking at it and followed Emily as she marched across the library and disappeared between rows of bookshelves. When they were out of sight from the tables, Emily whispered, "Did she fall for it?" James bent to a low shelf and slid aside books to create a tiny window. He crouched down and peered between the spines, watching for a moment before he held up a triumphant thumb. "I practically dropped the papers at her feet," James said. "Of course she couldn't resist." "Well, let's hope she uses them, and then the rest is up to Mr. Quisling. Hopefully he notices." In social studies, James made a big show of looking for another missing item when Mr. Quisling collected the cipher challenge submissions. No surprise to Emily or James, Maddie turned in her submission for the challenge. Mr. Quisling accepted it and looked it over. Slowly he raised his head, His eyes locked onto Maddie like lasers. Is this a joke, Miss Fernandez? What Maddie didn't realize was that the cipher wasn't James's. The cipher belonged to Babbage, copied word for word. Brilliant. It was a Sherlock's Holmes-level cipher, and Emily and James didn't have a clue how to solve it. James had included a fake solution among the pages to pretend to drop in the library. They figured either Mr. Quisling would recognize his own work, or later, when it went unsolved, Maddie would have to reveal her solution, which would prove to be a nonsensical answer key once she started walking the class through it. Emily was so pleased that her trick had worked, she almost missed Mr. Quisling's stare shift momentarily to herself. Almost. It was enough to remind Emily of an important detail she'd overlooked. Mr. Quisling knew she knew his book Scavenger identity as Babbage. If he recognized his own cipher from the website, then it was a logical step to connect it to her. Emily studied the carved diamond on her desk, but Mr. Quisling addressed Maddie, not Emily. I know this cipher, Miss Fernandez, and I know it's not yours. But cheating is not tolerated in this classroom on any assignment. Furthermore, you were warned last week about the consequences of turning in a cipher other than your own creation. I'm disqualifying you from the contest. James scribbled on his notebook and raised it for Emily to see D-U-S, or yes, in their cipher language. All they'd wanted was to give Maddie a taste of her own medicine. Having her disqualified was an added bonus. What? Maddie cried. That's not fair. Disqualified. End of discussion, Mr. Quisling said. You've wasted enough of our time. In the hallway after class, Maddie stomped up to Emily and James. You set me up, she cried so loudly students stopped to stare. Do you hear that? Emily cupped a hand around his ear. That's the sound of Steve celebrating my win. Don't worry, you'll look great as a redhead. Maddie blushed. Your win? I didn't lose. I was disqualified. I don't remember being that part of the bet. Do you remember that being part of the bet, Emily? Nope. The assignment was whoever earned more homework passes or got to 3 first. Disqualification wasn't mentioned, James says. I won 1 and you have, let me count. Oh, that's right, none. Whatever, it's a stupid bet. I wouldn't have made you shave your head. James snorted. Right. Emily turned on her heel and marched away into the crowd. You'll start a toadstool trend, James called after her. Embrace your fate. Don't be afraid of your own destiny. Do you think you'll do it? Emily asked. Not a chance, he said. It's okay, though. Watching her squirm was better than the toadstool hair. She probably would start a trend. She'd at least enjoy all the attention. That is the end of chapter 34. Finally, an insanely happy chapter. We have not seen that in a while in this book. So James won the cipher challenge. Unfortunately, her royal fungus will not be changing her hair to look like a mushroom, but can't win them all. All right, guys, I'll see you next time. Bye.